Hey guys, I'm Jordan Cutler, and this is Glitch in the Riff. On tonight's episode, we feature James O'Callaghan, who is originally from Vancouver, but received his Bachelor of Fine Arts from Simon Fraser University. James has also received his Master's in Musical Composition from McGill University in 2014. James is one of the co-founders and co-directors of the Montreal Contemporary Music Lab and was nominated for a Juno in Classical Composition in 2014. James uses acoustic and electroacoustic media, field recordings, amplified sounds, objects, computer-assisted transcriptions of environmental sounds, and unique performances. He also uses a full range of musical genres from chamber to orchestra to live electronic and audio installations. Now let's go to James.
So I'd like to welcome tonight James O'Callaghan. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So how's your day been?
It's going well. How are you?
Doing pretty good. Just busy with school, fourth year university. So yeah, all the fun out of that.
So much fun.
Oh yeah. So with here at Glitch in the Riff, how we usually like to start it is we like to start with asking about their pieces and that. But with your background, I actually like to start with your papers and lead into your compositional works. So my first question for you today is, having published 5 papers, what is the main difference that you found when coming from a composer side to more of the academic side of writing your theses?
Well, I don't find them. I'm very cerebral when I work in my artistic practice, and so it seems like a very natural complement to my creative thinking to work in a more academic way. So I don't have a lot of anxiety about that side of things, or the sort of I can't even say this word, academicization of music. And certainly thinking about my own background, I did come into music quite late and was already very interested in English literature and philosophy and these kinds of things. So it seemed very natural to continue thinking about music in a philosophical way, both when I compose and when I'm writing about music, whether it's my own or music of others.
That's great. So I didn't know that. So how'd you? This isn't one of the questions on here, but how'd you? You said you started later when coming to composition writing. Is that correct?
Yes. I guess it's relatively traditional in the compositional world that one begins at an early age studying an instrument and discovers writing acoustic music through that process. And for me, I didn't have any aspect of that in my life until I started university, where I started studying in an interdisciplinary fine arts program and fell into music quite by accident, and certainly fell in love with it in many different ways, both in electroacoustic music and writing acoustic music. So I still have never studied an instrument, and I think that experience is coming a little bit more and more common, but it's still maybe a little bit different from the traditional experience of a composer and their education.
Okay, cool. What is your do you have a background instrument, by the way?
None at all.
No, just more focused on the theory side of music composition.
That's right, I guess. I don't really have a performance practice besides live electronics, but that came kind of as a byproduct of composing.
Cool. That's awesome. So more back into the questions and that. having focused, reading upon your papers and that, having focused on the idea of mimesis, the Greek word for to imitate, can you describe to us why you decided to talk about mimesis in musical composition?
So, mimesis, when discussed in music, as you say, comes from the idea of imitation, and often it's related to using everyday sounds or references to the natural world or the real world in composition. I think historically the practice of Western music has been relatively rooted in an abstract discourse, a sort of formalist idea. And there's all sorts of talk around the idea of the kind of purity of music as a medium because of this. Of course, we have some sort of traditional antecedents to this idea in the form of program music, even going back to Renaissance madrigals, where there's imitation of bird songs. But I think that particularly since the recorded medium of electronic sound has entered part of compositional practice, that we have the means to think about referentiality and representation in music composition in ways that other art forms, especially visual art, have had for centuries, but that I think a lot of practitioners in music are only really beginning to think about and to try and use in their works recently. So that was the kind of means by which I became interested in accessing these kinds of ideas in my own work. The idea that to a certain extent it was kind of novel, it was something that I hadn't seen or heard a lot before in music, and also to kind of keep a sort of grounding, a connection in the real world, to think about environmental issues, political issues, social issues, things that I wanted to kind of connect my artistic practice to, such that it wasn't a completely self-indulgent activity. Although I think there's an element of that that one can't escape when involved in avant-garde artwork. So.
Yeah, that's really cool, actually, because it was weird because I was reading your paper and all of a sudden the next day we mentioned about mimesis in class and my prof was like, "Does anyone know what this is?" I'm like, "Actually, I read a paper about it." So that was really interesting. So also the next question. So creating new ways of composition, do you find it difficult to think of new ideas each time you compose a piece?
Yes and no. I think my composing is always very idea driven. So whenever I work, it's based on a very conceptual point of view. And that's not to say that every single piece is a completely novel idea, either from within my own work or between the existing work out there. So certainly I'm cross-pollinating my ideas and being shaped and influenced by the work around me. So certain pieces, I try to do things that are more new and that I even sort of confuse and startle me as I'm working on them, and others of them are more extensions of ideas that I've been thinking about.
Awesome. That's great because I find sometimes that's what a lot of artists have is the difficulty in doing different transitions and that from trying to break away from what they usually do as well. So I wanted to see what your viewpoint was on this.
Yeah, I think so. That's important. I think it's if I ever find myself in a position where I'm not able to come up with ways to sort of disturb my habits, I'll be not very happy or really interested in going on making music. So I hope it doesn't come to that for an extended period of time.
Yeah, you sort of just, when you're doing different compositions, especially looking into your background. How old are you again, by the way?
I'm 27.
27. And just looking at your background in that of how many different compositions you've written is a lot for someone your age, especially within the electroacoustic field. So it's great. Uh, um, so my next question for you is composing itself is an art, but as well, we see that adding more. Um, let me start that again. So composing itself is an art. So when we when we add electronics and coding elements into the musical composition as well, right? So could you tell us about what you think is the connection between composition and electronic form as one entity?
Mm. Well, I can say from my own experience that the electronic medium was my gateway into composition. So that's never far behind my work. I've written pieces that are purely instrumental in the past, though in a way I find it difficult in terms of the sort of things I'm thinking about right now in my work to imagine a future where I would write a purely acoustic piece, but I'm sure it's possible that I could do that again as I have in the past. So in one way or another, whether it's an integral part of the realization of the work as it is performed or realized in public or in a recorded document, or whether it's something that's just part of the process that helps me determine the way in which I write. I think that the sort of digital world, or at least the electronic world, is something that I find essential to the way that I think about my work.
Yeah, so I'm at the same point as you. Is when I started, I was mainly just thinking about different ways of doing just writing in that, but I never thought of using the electronic portion. So using patches like Max MSP, stuff like Super Collider, and more electronic based compositions I never thought of till I started a course in that at my university, and I was just like, oh wow, that's a new way of doing it, and I would have never known unless I'd taken this course.
Mm-hmm.
So how exactly did you get involved with electroacoustic music, by the way?
Well, as I said, it was sort of the beginning for me, so it wasn't something that presented a new way of thinking about music. Before I went to university, my first involvement in any kind of music was making electronica. Like in the last year of high school, I tinkered around with that. And so in my first year of university, I took a course that was not listed as major specific. It was open to non-majors. And that is an introductory course into electroacoustic music. And something about it really intrigued me, and I felt kind of almost cheated that I had never heard of this kind of music before, or this kind of way of thinking about music before. And it certainly appealed to me coming from my background in making electronica, where I was less interested in coming up with new tunes or beats than I was really working on the aspect of the sound. Really, I was thinking maybe I would go into production or something like that, to really thinking about working on sound. But then discovering that there was an art form where that was the central idea was really a revelation. So pursuing that path in many different directions was what led me to do what I do now, I guess.
That's great. That's what we want to try and build here at Glitching the Riff podcast, is try and get more people involved in both listening and appreciating what electroacoustic music, even stuff like live programming as well for musical composition, and try and get people more involved instead of using the top, like, listening to top 40 kind of stuff, sort of branching out more into different musical areas. So my next question is elaborating on the question I just asked. Can we see any more pieces with more coding based material? So stuff like Super Collider in your compositions?
I don't think, not as a chief element of the work for the foreseeable future. I haven't ever used Super Collider before. I've used some visual programming languages like Max, and some minimal implementations of C Sound and other more traditional programming languages for music. For me, the aspect of coding in my work, that should it ever exist, is really always as a means to an end. I haven't yet, as much as I appreciate it in other works, I haven't yet found an outlet in my own work to consider that coding should be an element that's exposed or really part of the discourse of the work. So I haven't been interested in live coding or these kinds of things where the idea of programming, the idea of coding is something that the work is really about.
That's interesting. So now I sort of want to talk more about one of your pieces. So using some non-musical instruments such as like books or duct tape in your piece, Reasons and Pre-Echo. What created the idea of using these in a way for composing?
Well, I think it ties back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier in terms of mimesis. I think when you have purely electroacoustic music, often we're dealing with recorded sounds that might be recognizable as being particular either environments, external environments, or particular objects that through their sound one can recognize what they are, and the sort of imaginary world of that reference forms an important part of the work. So integrating the kinds of ways that one might manipulate an object in the studio to develop an acousmatic work, for instance, into something like a performance practice in my works for live electronics, or in the case of Pre-Echo, chamber music. It felt like a very natural extension of the ideas that I was already working with in acousmatic music, and to some degree in instrumental music, by trying to analyze recorded sounds and reproduce them with instruments. In the case of Pre-Echo, the work is an attempt at transcribing an existing acousmatic work of mine. And so rather than attempt to get a string quartet to imitate the sounds of the found objects that I had already worked with in developing the acousmatic work, Empty's Impetus, it seemed like a very natural idea to try and get the performers to manipulate those objects in sort of a recreation of the compositional process of the acousmatic work in real time.
Great. So your next piece I wanted to talk about is one of your recent pieces, actually, Among M.A. and Empathies Impetus, if I'm saying that right.
Oh, sure. So two different pieces, Among M.A. and Empty's Impetus. So I mentioned a little bit already about Empty's Impetus in the context of its sort of relationship with the string quartet Pre-Echo after Empties. So that work, Empty's Impetus, is a purely acousmatic work. It's played over loudspeakers, and it's part of a trilogy of works that have a possible performance modality where they're partially diffused through speakers that are attached to or inside of musical instruments. So traditionally in an acousmatic concert, sound is played back through loudspeakers. Often one closes their eyes. The idea is that there's no visual component to the sound. And I was interested in kind of connecting a little bit to the visual aspect, or the sort of severance of the visual aspect in acousmatic music, by having physical instruments on stage. So in Empty's Impetus, I have, sometimes when I perform it, the four instruments of the string quartet, so two violins, viola, and a cello on stage, and there are small transducer speakers attached to the sides of the instruments. And during the work, I send the sound of the fixed electroacoustic piece through those instruments so that they vibrate and add some new acoustic coloring based on their unique properties to the sound. It's very different from how a loudspeaker, a more neutral kind of diffusion, might sound. So it's a way of kind of trying to deal with the objecthood and the physicality of those instruments, and also the sort of ghostly aspect of severing something that is used to produce sound that's not producing it directly, but is instead acting just as a vessel for sound. So that's Empty's Impetus. And then Among M.A. is a recent chamber work with electronics, where I was really interested in trying to mess with the consecration of musical space and musical action. So it's a little bit related ideas. In this case, I'm thinking about the stage as a place where we have a kind of schema as listeners as where the music takes place. So the work is kind of a site-specific work for a hall in Montreal, the Château Historique de Bon Pasteur, where there's a room behind the stage that one can see with glass doors. And so interacting with that space that often in concerts there you can see, but it's not really an impactful part of the performance. You might see reflections of the musicians who are on stage through the glass doors. And the first time I saw a concert there, I was really interested in the idea of interacting with the extended space of the concert hall. So I did that in this work. And also in terms of the kinds of actions the musician performs in the piece, and the performance of a work that are not necessarily considered to have a musical intention in musical performance. So the moving of one's chair, the rustling of one's sheet music, the rosining of bows, these kinds of things become performed actions among art. And I was interested in, by including those things in the work, giving them a musical quality, and then by extension, sort of giving an everyday quality to the more musical actions or expectedly musical actions that are also in the work.
That's great. Yeah, that when I was listening to those pieces, they're really, really interesting. Especially one of my favorites out of the two was Among and Ma. So yeah. So the next question I have for you is, looking more into your background. You're one of the co-founders in the Montreal Contemporary Music Lab. So what made the decision in creating a space for performers, composers, and sound artists in Montreal?
Well, everyone who was involved in the creation of that program and who is involved now in the operation of it is a practicing artist in some way, either they're a performer, a composer, a sound artist, or some mix of the three. And so the idea of the lab was something that we identified as something that we would have liked in our lives, whether right now or at some point in the past. And so it was really a way of building community, both within Montreal, across different disciplines, across different educational institutions, for example, as well as the rest of Canada. And often we have participants from elsewhere as well. And also really trying to look at the process of new music creation and sound art creation, and thinking about the collaborative aspect, and really trying to create a space for the discussion around healthy new music creation, around how much time or in what manner we create new works and what our relationships are like that. So it's really a kind of community-driven organization. We really try to foster the idea of a healthy community. Yeah.
Cool. So two more questions for you. So what are some current projects that you are working currently on?
So what I'm finishing up right now is actually the work I've already discussed, pre-Echo After Empties, and that's the string quartet that's modeled after Empties Impetus. The first movement of that work, which was a transcription of the first 10 minutes of Empties Impetus, was premiered in June in Montreal, and the entire work, including the new second movement, completing a full 20-minute piece, will be premiered in February in Banchory, Scotland. And so that's what I'm finishing up right now. And then I'm also working on chamber plus electronics pieces for a saxophone quartet, Quasar in Montreal, a sextet in Vancouver, Standing Wave, and then an exchange between the two ensembles of 8 flutes directed by Véronique Lecroix of Ensemble Contemporain de Montréal that will be performed in Vancouver and Montreal.
That's great. That sounds great. Wow, I can't wait to hear or see and hear what you have done. So our final question for you tonight is, so being involved in all these different areas of composition, such as acoustic, live electronics, installations, orchestra, chamber, and vocal pieces. Which of the different styles of composition do you prefer writing for?
Hmm. I don't know if I have a particular preference. They all feel pretty different, and I like to create links between them as much as possible. So whether that's within a particular work where I'm working with both electronic and acoustic elements, or between works where I'm transcribing from one to the other, or creating sort of spiritual extensions like installations that are based off of concert works. Um, I'm interested in looking at the same ideas through different lenses. So there are things that I miss if I'm writing a purely um, electronic piece, for example. Always the feedback is right there and immediate, and so I don't get the kind of surprise and excitement of hearing something for the first time, which I really relish in writing instrumental music. And conversely, writing instrumental music, I really miss that immediate oral feedback in the compositional process. And so finding ways to sort of bleed between those experiences when I compose is something I'm interested in for sure.
That's great. So sorry, but I also have one more question for you.
No problem.
So the final question. So what do you find is the importance of electroacoustic music and why it should be more involved in the community itself and within the world itself as well?
Ooh, I don't know if I can really give a compelling justification for the existence of the thing that I'm interested in. I mean, from a purely self-interested perspective, I think it's neat, and so I hope that other people do. And speaking about my own experience, as I mentioned, I felt rather cheated that I had not discovered this form of music until rather late in life. So I think that we are often very introspective and sort of hesitant to share our work with the public for fear that it might not be appreciated. It's a kind of insular community to a certain extent. But I think a lot of experiences show that it's often something that's a lot more, to use a dirty word, accessible than we often like to think. So that's certainly a motivator to try and reach out to people who are not immediately involved in the discipline. Absolutely. And just from my own experience of being involved in these works, they have a lot to offer. So I think that any efforts we can make to share that with others can be warmly received.
That's great. So thank you again. So thank you very much for doing this interview with me for Glitch in the Rift.
Well, thanks very much.
Yeah, very acknowledging, and I hope our viewers in that really enjoy listening to what you've had to say, and I hope it inspires other people as well, getting involved in electroacoustic music and getting more involved within that genre, the side of music that no one really pays too much attention to, for what I find.
Right. Well, thanks for all your work and kind of making that possible through efforts like this podcast.
Well, thank you. Well, have yourself a good night, and hopefully I'll talk to you later.
All right. Likewise. Take care.
Thanks for joining us tonight. If you'd like to look at more of James's pieces, please visit the link below. Next week, we feature Richard Garrett talking about his audio spray gun. Hope to hear from you soon.